morning, students. Today we are going to continue Act 1 in our play, All My Sons. Today we are going to explain from page 26 to page 38. Before starting, let's remember where we have stopped in the previous video. We stopped at the conversation between Mother and Anne. Mother asked Anne if she was still waiting for Larry, but Anne replied frankly that she wasn't waiting for Larry. Then Frank entered and asked Anne about her family. Now let's know the summary of these pages. Frank enters and asks Anne about her brother George. She tells him that he has become a lawyer. He also asks when her father expects a conditioned leave from prison, and Anne feels uneasy. After Frank leaves, Anne is disappointed to realize that the townspeople are still talking about her father and the old crime, even though he has been in prison for years now. Keller asks Anne not to take it so hard on herself. He tells her that the people who had called them murderers are now friends, and he lends them money. Keller then tells her how he faced the neighbors after he was acquitted. He walked slowly down the street with a smile on his face. In their eyes he was a murderer beast, but he wasn't, and he had a paper from court that proves he is innocent. After 14 months he had one of the best shops in the state and became a respected man and bigger than ever. Keller tells Anne that her family has made a big mistake by running away from town. They should have stayed and faced the people. We get to know that Keller and Anne's father, Steve Deaver, had been in business together during the war, and they had sold a shipment of cracked cylinder heads to the Air Force, which caused the crash of 21 planes and the death of their pilots in Australia. Both Steve and Keller were arrested and tried. Steve was found guilty and sent to jail, but Keller was acquitted and went home. Anne asks Keller whether he still hates her father because he was his partner and he got him involved into that scandal. Keller says that he doesn't like him, but he should forget and forgive. Then he asked her to tell her father the next time she sees him that he has a job awaiting him. Anne is surprised that Keller does not hold any bad feelings against her father, although her father tried to blame the whole crime on him. Anne herself does hold bad feelings against her father. She says that neither she nor her brother visited their father in prison or even wrote to him since Larry was reported missing. They were so angry because she says they considered Steve responsible for Larry's death, as one of those cracked cylinder heads could have been in the plane that crashed with Larry inside. Mother is angered by this remark and she insists that it all has nothing to do with Larry because simply he isn't dead. Keller too is shocked by this remark and said that Steve couldn't be responsible for Larry's death because Larry has never flown P-40. In fact, he was defending himself and rejecting the idea that he might have caused the death of his own son. Chris burst out in anger, saying whether Anne's father was responsible for Larry's death or not, he is still a criminal because he was the murderer of 21 pilots. Keller defends Steve, saying that the man might have been careless but not a murderer because during the time of war there was a lot of work and a little time. The army demanded cylinder heads urgently. He also adds that Steve was a little man who has always been afraid of loud voices. When the army called for the cylinder heads, Steve had some cracked ones. He covered the cracks and sent them believing that the mechanic in the army would discover them and send them back. Keller says that it was just a mistake, not murder. Joe and Kate exist Anne and Chris stay. Anne says that she will not stay because she felt that Kate isn't welcoming her, and Chris is rather embarrassed because he has invited her. Chris changes her mind by confessing his love. We know that Anne has been in love with Chris for the previous couple of years, and she has been waiting for him to confess his love. Anne still feels that Chris is ashamed of a mysterious thing. Chris explains that during the war he was at the head of a group of soldiers who were all such brave men that they killed themselves for one another. He felt ashamed to be the only survivor among them. He couldn't stand the idea of living happily, getting a good job, and marrying a lovely girl. He was ashamed of that comfortable life. This shows that Chris is an idealist. Anne says that Chris should be happy with his good fortune and proud of his money and his father's business. Keller enters and says that George, Anne's brother, is on the phone and exists to answer the phone. Keller gets worried. He wants to know why George is calling his sister from Columbus, where his father is imprisoned. He can't understand how, after all those years, George goes to visit his father, and why he calls. Keller is suspicious that George and Anne are trying to open up the old case again, and Chris is angered by this remark. Keller changes the subject and says he wants to rename the business for Chris, but Chris is uneasy with this proposition. Keller suspects that Chris is ashamed of his money, and he insists that it's good and moral money. Anne returns and says that George will be coming that night. She and Chris leave. Mother enters and is taken by the fact that George needs to speak to Anne. She asks what Steve has told George and what has made George to take an airplane from New York to see his father. Keller insists that there is nothing to worry about, and Mother twice asks him to beware that matter. Mother finishes with warning Keller to be smart. Now open your booklet, page 83, in order to continue the summary in your booklet. Anne is sensitive. She wants to know if the neighbors still talk about her father and his crime. Chris and Joe say no. Anne remembers the neighbors screaming murderers at her father, Steve, and at Joe. In a long monologue, Joe records the day he was cleared of the crime. He and Steve had been accused of selling cracked cylinder heads to the Air Force, causing 21 planes to crash. Joe was exonerated, and the father was imprisoned. When Joe returned home, he walked down the street with defiance and pride. He suggests the same for Steve when he is released. Anne admits that neither she nor her brother keep in touch with their father anymore. They blame him for knowingly shipping out faulty parts, resulting in the death of so many American pilots. She wonders aloud whether this was responsible for Larry's death. That really sets Kate off, and should never say that again. Keller tells his version of the story. There was a mad rush for parts, and when the cylinders came out cracked, cowardly Steve just decided to send them out. He was afraid that Joe and the military would be displeased with the mistake, so he kept quiet about it. Chris breaks in. He just wants a change of subject, so they talk about steak and champagne instead, and Keller exists. The long-awaited proposal occurs. Chris asks, Anne says yes. Now they just have to figure out how to tell Kate. Chris has something to get off his chest. It's about the war, leading a company. He lost all his men, Then he returned to the States and felt that nobody noticed, that the sacrifice of the men who died meant nothing substantial to the people at home. He has survivor's guilt. Chris feels as though he doesn't deserve life and doesn't deserve her. Anne sets him straight. He does deserve her, and he better kiss her right now. Joe interrupts them. There is a phone call from George, Anne's brother. Chris tells Joe the news of his engagement to Anne, but Joe is preoccupied with this phone call. He is afraid George will want to open up his father's case again, and that Anne is on his side. Anne emerges. George is coming there to settle something. He wouldn't say what. This rattles Joe and Kate. Kate tells Joe to be smart. Now questions with model answers concerning this part. She ought to know, shouldn't she? Chris said this to Mother and shocked Mother by saying that she wasn't waiting for Larry. However, Mother didn't believe and said that inside Anne's heart she is still waiting. Chris said the above words. He meant Anne is the only one who must be sure about what's in her heart. Then he has gone forever. You are sure? Chris said these words to Anne when she told him that she had always loved him all those 3 years. Chris asked her if she was sure about Larry's missing or death. She said that she really forgot him and she is not waiting. What was Mr. Keller accused of, or what was the crime committed in the play? The crime committed in the play, or Mr. Keller was accused of shipping cracked cylinder heads to the Air Force. This shipment caused the crash of 21 planes and the death of their pilots. Why was Keller worried about George's phone call? Keller was worried about George's phone call because George called him from Columbus, where his father was imprisoned. Keller thought that George was going to open the old case again. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow, inshallah. Goodbye.